Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. Today we are joined with Gideon Lazar to discuss a very subtle but I think very interesting philosophical and even theological controversy. It regards Duns Scotus and his understanding of hylomorphism, specifically with regards to substantial form and the plurality of substantial forms. Mr. Lazar, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for being on. I'm trying to get other SCOTUS specialists on the podcast just because studying St. Thomas is hard enough, but like also trying to deep dive into SCOTUS is also pretty difficult. So I'm trying to find other heavy hitters. I know that you had that big interview with Dr. Goff the other like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, he's very excellent. And a good chunk of what I talk about with SCOTUS is stuff that I learned from him and my discussions with him. And so he's absolutely brilliant. And he studied under the late Father Peter Damian Fellner, who was sort of probably the foremost living SCOTist up until his death a few years ago.
Nice. Very good. Okay, yeah. I'll definitely have to give your talk a listen. Well, I thought that maybe we could just sort of dive right into it. Maybe we can also get a bit more info about yourself. How did you come to develop an interest in Scotism and the Franciscan tradition and spirituality? As I understand it, you sort of underwent a conversion with your old Jewish faith to Catholicism.
Yeah, so when I first became Christian in high school, I actually ended up becoming Eastern Orthodox. And some of the things that answered my objections to Catholicism was really looking at Scotus. And really, I think at that time, only at a very surface level, that he seemed to answer some of the questions, but I didn't really look into as in detail at that time why he was giving the answers he was giving to these Orthodox objections. And so if people are interested in that, they can check out either Jared Goff, some of his interviews on reason and theology, or watch my video on the Trinity or my interview with him on the Trinity, just to look at how SCOTUS would approach some of these Orthodox Catholic issues differently. But that got me a little bit interested in SCOTUS. And when I actually came over to Catholicism, I ended up moving more Thomist for a little while, simply because there's a lot more resources on Thomism in English, at least at first glance. I actually think that there is a lot of good SCOTUS material. It's just not well known. And so especially through reading people like Ed Feser, I became very interested in Thomism. But one of the things that struck me is I was very convinced of the absolute primacy of Christ from a SCOTUS perspective, and really through my reading of the Eastern Fathers, especially St. Maximus the Confessor. And when I would dialogue with some Thomists on this, they were really hostile to it, just on the basis that St. Thomas disagrees, so therefore it couldn't be correct. And of course, I think as a Thomist, you could completely affirm the absolute primacy of Christ. I don't think there's anything contrary to Thomas's principles about that. But it got me interested enough to look a little bit more into SCOTUS and start studying SCOTUS's theology closer, and especially through reading people like Father Peter Damian Fellner and Alan Walter. I got very interested in SCOTUS because they seemed to have a lot of the answers to questions I was asking at the time.
Very nice. All right, then. Yeah, for me, myself, I started to deep dive into to Thomism through Feser as well. I think it was 5 Proofs when it came out. That was kind of the first thing that got me like hooked on Thomism. And then really in the past few years or so, I've started to explore medieval philosophy and more generally.
Yeah, I will mention that when I was in college, well, I was still Orthodox. I became Catholic in beginning of my junior year of college. But before that, I had studied metaphysics, and I actually had a Thomist professor for the class. So we started off reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, and then we went over to St. Thomas's De Ente et Essentia. And that allowed me to get a good grounding in metaphysics. And so my entry into discussion in metaphysics, even though I was still Orthodox at the time, was through Thomism. And it was partly then by looking at some of the Eastern Fathers, where I was attempting to sort of work my way back into a more patristic metaphysics,
Hmm.
starting off from atomist metaphysics, because that's what I had learned.
Very interesting. I thought that maybe we could just dive right into the subject matter. But before we discuss maybe Aquinas's position briefly and then discuss Blessed Duns Scotus's position, I thought that maybe we could give a sort of brief introduction to hylomorphism in general. So what is hylomorphism? Why does Aristotle sort of posit this doctrine, and why is it important for the study of physics and the philosophy of nature?
Yeah, so just from the word there, you can see we have from Greek hulos and morphe, literally matter and form. And so all hylomorphism means is that substances are composed of both matter and form. So within sort of modern popular conceptions of what things are made of, atomism has really taken over. So we think everything is just a composite of lots of atoms. And the only difference between a human and a rock is that the human is made of more atoms and in a different order. Well, for Aristotle, matter itself is actually just potential. Matter couldn't make up a rock because matter is just potential. It doesn't have the power to become something. So he says what you have then is form, and form makes the thing what it is. So if we just have, for example, a rock, it's made of prime matter and then the substantial form of a rock, which causes it from just being prime matter into being a rock. And he's drawing this somewhat from Plato, but for Plato, you just have prime matter here in the world, and you have these forms off in some sort of heavenly realm. And the stuff here comes to participate within these forms, forming them into what they are. But Aristotle points out quite a number of issues with this view of Plato's view of forms. But he realizes it's also answering questions that the atomists can't seem to be answering. And so this is one way in which Aristotle comes to this conclusion of hylomorphism. He also comes to this conclusion from looking at the problem of change. Parmenides posits this issue of that if something is changing, it's changing from what it is not into now what it is. Well, that means something is coming from nothing, which is clearly a contradiction. I mean, something can't come from nothing. And so the other, Aristotle does want to affirm, right, that we are really seeing things. You have the other extreme of Heraclitus, and Heraclitus said there actually is no being, there's only becoming. So all we're seeing in the world is change. We're never seeing things. But Aristotle sees clearly from common sense. We see both things and we see change. So whatever we're going to have has to account for both things and change. And so he says that there is something that changes. We have a change from one substantial form to another. But there's also something that remains the same. That is the matter which underlies it. So the matter remains the same from one thing to the next. And when we start getting into Scotus's position, this concern of Aristotle that there has to be continuity between one thing and the next thing will become very important to some of Scotus's arguments regarding his positions on matter.
Very interesting. So as I also understand it, Aristotle hints at, and later philosophers following after him subdivides the form of a thing. They subdivide it into substantial form versus an accidental form.
Yeah.
What exactly is that?
Yeah, so it seems pretty clear, at least from my studies, that Aristotle seems to almost explicitly deny that there is any accidental form. He says that accidents just inhere within the substance. And I don't know who first posits accidental form, but I know it's within St. Thomas, so I could talk about his arguments for it. So he talks about how form seems to have some sort of rationality we can understand, right? In order for it to have that, it has to have a form. There has to be something that our mind is understanding within the thing. And he says that these accidental forms, if they don't exist on their own, they inhere in the substantial form. So really a thing only has one form. but you could then virtually subdivide that into a substantial form and accidental forms.
I see. So for instance, we could take like a statue of Hermes where we could say like the height or its weight or something of that sort, or its color would be accidents, whereas you know, its substantial form is a statue of Hermes.
Yeah, so it's a statue of Hermes, and let's say the statue is painted blue. Let's say his cloak is painted blue. Right, so that blueness is inherent within it, because you can't just have blueness existing on its own. It's not like you could just have matter have blueness and form matter, and now we just have blueness on its own. But it's neither the case that it would be a different statue if we had painted the cloak green instead. It still seems to be the same statue of Hermes, just painted a different color. So we have to then, and also at the same time, the blue is something our mind can comprehend. It's not as though it's blue, but our mind's unable to access that truth. So there has to be something that our mind can access. There has to be some sort of form here that our mind is then accessing within the thing.
I see. Yeah, and as I also understand it, prime matter is it's seen as like purely potential, and a substantial form is that which actualizes matter and makes it to be the kind of thing that it is. Is it the case that actuality and potentiality are convertible with form and matter for well, I should say maybe for Aristotle and then later scholastic thinkers?
It seems in Aristotle, this is his basis for viewing the question, but he never would fully answer if this fully answers the question. There's a fundamental problem already within Aristotle here of if form is this principle of actuality, why is one thing end up being more actual than another, right? Why is something closer to its end? And Aristotle's answer to this is prime matter, that matter is this principle of limitation within a thing. But why isn't then, right, if we take out the matter, why wouldn't the form be different from just God? Because God is pure actuality. And Aristotle can't seem to fully answer that question. And so St. Thomas will later introduce a distinction. And I think this distinction he's really drawing here partly from Avicenna, but fleshing it out more.
Yes. That
we have a distinction then between the essence and the being. That's called the existence of the thing, the esse. And so that causes an essence, which is now potential with respect to being. And so being causes it then to be. And so you have this solution then to the problem raised by, I don't think Aristotle himself discusses this possibility, but it seems to be present within the logical outworking of his metaphysics there, if that makes sense.
Right, right. I mean, I do recall that in some, he's not, as I understand it, Aristotle's not overly impressed with the sort of transmigration theory of souls, but there are passages in his work where he seems to suggest that the soul sort of like can survive the death of the body. Like I think in the Nicomachean Ethics, he seems to suggest this, but he doesn't exactly like, you know, develop it or thinking, okay, what exactly would it be like for like pure form to like sort of subsist in and of itself? And as I understand it, another solution was sort of posited by Bonaventure and others that would sort of posit a spiritual matter that, okay, it's not like a matter of dimensions, but there is a limitation on angelic, you know, separated substances, and this is spiritual matter.
Yeah, we can get more into that when we get into Scotus.
Sure.
But yeah.
Yeah, so I think that maybe we could just dive right into Aquinas's position. Again, I'll probably just breeze through it because it's my hope one day to have a podcast devoted just to substantial form and prime matter for Aquinas. But Aquinas, in his works, pretty much follows Aristotle on this account. In his De Principis Naturae, he posits, you know, there's sort of like three necessary preconditions for generation. There's matter, there's form, and then there's privation. And then of course, there's the agent that acts, but those are sort of the preconditions for Aquinas.
Yeah, there's one fundamental area where St. Thomas does depart from Aristotle, is this question of distinguishing being from the essence, because Aristotle never raises this question of distinguishing being and essence. And interestingly, that causes St. Thomas to distinguish essence and form. is Aristotle grants sort of as a conceptual distinction between essence and form, that these words don't mean the same thing.
Right, right.
And Aristotle at one point sort of goes with the idea, what if these are really distinct? And Aristotle says, no, ultimately, something's essence is just its form. And St. Thomas has a sort of pious reading of Aristotle here, where he reads Aristotle as saying the opposite of what Aristotle's actually saying in the passage he cites.
Yes.
That Aristotle agrees with him that essence is not the same thing as form.
Yeah, it's the composite. It's the composite that constitutes essence, right?
Yeah, it's the composite both of form and matter. But then essence stands with potentiality with respect to being. And this also then raises a question that was debated quite a bit in 20th century Thomism and is still going on over, for St. Thomas, is the primary role of potentiality and being. Is this fundamentally come from the relationship of being in essence, or does it fundamentally come from form and matter? Because for Aristotle, these principles are clearly coming from form and matter. But the existential Thomists, such as Etienne Gilson, want to move that to a focus on being in essence instead of focused on form and matter.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I also understand that Aquinas also sort of connects his understanding of hylomorphism with his own understanding of participation. And we did an episode with Dr. Kerr on this, so I'll just link the episode in below. But he sees he sees that his conception of hylomorphism works well with his theory of participation, because form for St. Thomas is of itself common, and it's only limited or made particular through the reception of this designated matter or that designated matter, and that's how he sort of sees hylomorphism. I don't know if Aristotle would be comfortable with that reading necessarily, but that's St. Thomas's reading.
Yep. Yeah, I think I actually heard this from Dr. Kerr, where he mentions at one point, it seems like one of the few spots where St. Thomas openly disagrees with Aristotle's when it comes to participation, because Aristotle says in the Metaphysics that Platonists don't really have a good definition for what participation is. And St. Thomas sort of responds, no, they do, and explains what they mean. Yeah,
I believe that's it. That's in his commentary on the Metaphysics, where he sort of says, well, this is what the Platonists meant, and he gives a sort of definition of participation. Yeah. There is a very interesting debate among Thomists these days whether we should fundamentally characterize Aquinas as an Aristotelian or a Platonist. I kind of find the debate a little bit anachronistic, since sort of Aquinas is sort of borrowing from a bunch of different positions, and not only different positions but interpretations of certain positions.
And I think the whole distinction between Platonism and Aristotelianism, I mean, it's a distinction that's starting to really arise around this time as different people are considering themselves Aristotelians and Platonists. But it's already very anachronistic, because the people who preserved and commented on Aristotle's works in the ancient world was pretty much the Neoplatonists who were doing that. Right,
and another difficulty during that time was mistaken authorship and misattributed text. I mean, the writings of, I believe it was Proclus's Elements of Theology, the Liber de Causis was attributed to Aristotle, and I think Aquinas was one of the very first to say, okay, this doesn't make sense.
And Jared Goff actually did his dissertation on Bonaventure's reception of Aristotle. It's a book called Caritas in Primo. I highly recommend the book. And he looked at Bonaventure's, his questions, disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity, because this was the first work that Bonaventure did after the study of Aristotle was mandated at the University of Paris. So now he had to include Aristotle in the curriculum. And Bonaventure is often portrayed as a very anti-Aristotelian, but it's actually not the case. We start seeing large numbers of citations of Aristotle within Bonaventure's work. The main difference, though, is that for St. Thomas, I mentioned that he has these pious readings of Aristotle sometimes, where he wants to make Aristotle say what he thinks is correct, even when Aristotle clearly isn't saying that. Versus for Bonaventure, he's pretty fine to just say Aristotle was wrong on something.
Right.
And it's also the case that the most cited work of Aristotle in Bonaventure is the Liber de Causis.
Interesting. Huh.
So it's funny that the work that's not actually by Aristotle is the lens through which he's really reading the rest of Aristotle through. And he's especially getting his view of hierarchy through the Liber de Causis.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I also understand that Pope Emeritus Benedict, when he was the cardinal, I think it was Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, he wrote a book on Bonaventure's history, and he discusses this sort of controversy of whether or not we should, ascribe to Bonaventure anti-Aristotelian sentiment or pro-Aristotelian sentiment, and it was a very interesting work that he wrote. I think
that's a good work.
Yeah. I think he also engages in Etienne Gilson in that work too. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. So and another claim that Aquinas makes, and I don't know if it's also explicit in the physics, but the claim that Aquinas makes is that prime matter in and of itself can't exist because in and of itself it's purely potential. It's not known through itself. It's only sort of known through like a negation analogy.
Yeah.
And it's also can't like subsist in of itself. Prime matter is purely potential for Aquinas.
And this is where maybe you could clarify to not fully understanding St. Thomas's position, but this is where I think you start to see issues in St. Thomas's view that matter is the principle of individuation. Because it seems to me that if matter doesn't even have any sort of being itself, how can matter actually distinguish between one thing and another? It's just potentiality. I don't know if you know more on that.
Well, I understand that it's not matter as such; it's designated matter. It's this chunk of matter, that chunk of matter.
Okay.
So I mean, I would nuance it a little bit, but the principle of individuation debate is a very, very. Admittedly, I've had a very hard time trying to see how it's true, especially when it comes to like the separation of the soul from the body. How exactly that works. Like, okay, what's the principle of individuation then? Is it accidents? Is it that it was at one point united to matter? That's a question I don't quite know the fully the answer to. So I'll
you wouldn't have to get into that. Yeah.
But and another claim that he makes is that and this is a very, very controversial one, both philosophically and theologically, is that each thing is composed of a singular substantial form, a form that makes it to be the kind of substance that it is, and then it's accompanied with accidental forms. So I think I have a quotation, and he has sorts of reasons for why he wants to reject the alternative, which would be a plurality of substantial forms. So you might a pluralist might say that okay, in the human composite there's a sort of corporeal form that informs the material components into such a way, and then super added onto that is a rational soul, and it's a plurality of substantial forms versus the unicity, which just says that no, that there really isn't a sort of corporeal form. The rational soul acts as the form of the body of the human composite. Would you say that that's a fair analysis of what the two positions are? Or?
Yeah. And so this has implications, right? So if we want, for example, if someone had their hands cut off, right, that would then cease to be their hand.
Yes.
It would be something that looks identical to their hand, but it would still be now a distinct thing. Or actually, when the person dies, it's not actually their body anymore.
Right.
It's just something that looks identical to their body.
Yeah, it's an accidental configuration of like organs and body parts that really aren't even a substance anymore, right?
Yeah. And he actually posits that there are multiple forms which change as this goes on. So you'll have first their substance of the corpse, then you'll have the substance of the putrefying corpse, and then I think there's one more, and then finally you end up with they've simply decomposed and there's no longer even parts there.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, but now you have a big issue, right? How, for example, when the soul leaves the body, what now causes all these other forms to appear here in the dead body? Because it seems that there isn't a new principle of actuality being introduced then to bring about these new forms. And interestingly, this becomes a problem that St. Thomas doesn't really solve. But I was going to quickly bring up Francisco Suarez, a later famous Thomist, who does try and answer this question. And so he says, well, there's nothing, it doesn't seem like there's any effects here on Earth that could do it. Then he looks at, could there be celestial causes? So could the movement of the planets cause substantial form to appear? And I know that sounds absurd to us now,
Sure.
but on a sort of pre-modern view of the planets, that question made perfect sense because the planets affected things here on Earth.
Right, the heavenly,
Yeah, but he can't figure out how this could be connected to the planets. So ultimately, he comes to the conclusion that God brings about the form of the decomposing body when the soul leaves the body.
I see.
But this seems to me to be a little bit it seems to be a little bit sort of
convenient.
Yeah, convenient. It's sort of the God of the gaps. This is sort of what we get accused of sometimes. And we just believe in when we can't find a scientific explanation, we just say God did it. And it almost seems like that's what we're doing here.
Sure. And it does seem rather convenient that like a completely different form sort of out of nowhere appears once the separation of the body and soul occurs.
Yeah,
accidental. And
I think
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I think some other Thomists have brought about the possibility that essentially the forms are virtually contained. So the form of the corpse is virtually contained within the soul, that when the soul leaves the body, it produces then the form of the corpse.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, as I understand it, Aquinas does in his earliest works, I think it's his sentence commentary, Whipple talks about this in his chapter in Metaphysical Thought, where he seems to suggest that early Aquinas was quite hesitant to like fully embrace this idea of like a plurality of substantial, of unicity of a unicity of substantial forms. He seems to play around with the idea that there is a sort of corporeal form in addition to the rational soul principle. But early on, but later on, I think Aquinas' mature position is very clear that okay, there's only one substantial form, and it is the soul. And there he has his reasons for wanting to hold to this doctrine. You know, it was very controversial during his day, and very much so after his death. But his main reason seems to be he's concerned about the unicity of a substance. There's a quotation that I have from Summa Theologica, question 76, or Article 3, where he says, you know, in the first place, an animal would not be absolutely one in which there were several souls. For nothing is absolutely one except by one form, by which a thing has existence, because a thing has from the same source both existence and unity, and therefore things which are denominated by various forms are not absolutely one, as for instance, a white man. So end quote. So it seems that for Aquinas, he's very much concerned that if we posit a plurality of substantial forms in one substance, there really isn't one substance. There's more than one substance, and that kind of, you know, seems difficult to maintain. And another objection that he gives throughout his work, that, you know, if substantial forms makes matter to be the kind of thing that it is substantially, any additional form wouldn't be, you know, it wouldn't be a substantial form, it would be merely accidental. So the soul really wouldn't be a substantial form, it'd be like an accidental add-on to a substance. So it really seems that for Aquinas, you either have to posit, you know, more than one substance in the same subject, or you have to hold that any additional form sort of added on would just be accidental, and neither of those positions, you know, seem very tenable. At least to Aquinas, they're not.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, then that objection is going to be a very important one that Scotus is going to have to consider when we go into Scotus's position. It's also going to briefly mention that you notice that St. Thomas in his earlier time is not as certain on this, and I think that this is a general evolution we see within St. Thomas's thought. That when he's younger, he's much more, as you could say, maybe Augustinian. As I actually don't know St. Augustine's direct position on this, but there seems to be this general tradition that's more focused on just looking at St. Augustine and St. Anselm and some of these earlier writers. And St. Thomas moves from that to much more of an Aristotelian position in his later life, to the point where even thinkers who are probably closer to a lot of these older sources, such as Scotus, end up a generation later discussing primarily the texts of Aristotle because of how ubiquitous Aristotle's positions had become by the end of St. Thomas's life.
Yeah, I mean, the question of patristic literature in Aquinas's and how exactly that either evolves or changes, that's not a question that I'm familiar with, but I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that he's departing necessarily from these texts. I actually don't know a lot of these authors, what their view on these subjects would be. Sure. I just mean more a general tradition that was going on within early scholasticism of commenting on these texts and some of the solutions they came up with.
Sure. Okay, well, I think that we've covered at least a brief introduction to Aquinas's own position. Is there anything else you want to add before we dive into Scotus? Or
yeah, I would just briefly mention that for Thomas, we sort of mentioned this offhand, but for the human, the form is identical with the rational soul.
Yes.
And so I think that's important to consider as well, because this is going to be where one of the main objections to Thomas is coming about, even within his own day. But there's a question of how do we have all these different powers of the soul, right? How are those basically the same as these effects that seem to be happening on the body? And the primary position was actually not so much Scotus's view, we're going to have a whole plurality of forms that make something up. It's rather more you have a form and then another form on top of it, where you have the form of corporeality.
Yes.
That then is added to it the form of the rational soul.
Yeah, right.
And there's a question of how many do you have here? So for example, Richard of Middleton, who is probably the most famous student of St. Bonaventure, posits that actually you have sort of 4 levels here. You have the form of corporeality, then you have the vegetative soul, then you have the sensitive soul, and then finally you have the rational soul. And so plants then would have 2 levels of form, animals would have 3, and humans would then have 4. And also there was a question going on at this time of spiritual matter. So for St. Thomas, you have the body, which is made of matter, that's then informed by the rational soul. Mm-hmm. Well, for most of these Franciscan thinkers, you have the body, which is informed by the form of the body, and the soul, which is spiritual matter informed by the soul, that then do exist in some sort of relationship of formal causality. So they're not saying that the soul is not the form, does not inform the body, but it's secondary to this informing that happens directly between these forms and the matter, whether physical or spiritual matter. Really, if people want to read more on this, I highly recommend Michael Sullivan's dissertation, The Debate Over Spiritual Matter in the Late 13th Century, Gonzalez Hispanus in the Franciscan Tradition from Bonaventure to Scotus.
Right.
Because he shows very well how this works. And there's really 2 arguments that the Franciscans are bringing about here. They have one thing where they want to talk about the individuation of the angels is one of them. So how do we individuate one angel from another? For St. Thomas, every angel is a distinct nature from another. So angel isn't actually a species, it's a genus.
Yeah, and each species of angel is wholly unique. There's not like one of the same kind of
yeah.
I've had a really hard time reconciling that with the choirs of angels, like the 9. It's like, okay, how does that work exactly? If each one's their own unique little angel. I don't understand that.
And that becomes an issue, right? So it's really easy if we want to bring this up to the level of archangels, for example, we could composite. Well, Michael's name, for example, seems to be who is like unto God. So maybe that's his nature, right, of that. But we start getting into an issue. Does every guardian angel have its own unique species? Yeah. So does my guardian angel now have a totally different species from your guardian angel?
Right.
To the point where they're only in the same category, but they're not really the same type of thing. That
right, it's only like nominally, like, okay, we're going to call you guardian angels, but there's really no demarcation that makes you guardian angels except
exactly, yeah.
activity. Yeah.
And so this is one concern that's being brought up here. Another concern that they have is change, right? So the soul seems to undergo change, but how can a substantial form undergo change?
Right. If the form is the principle of actuality, how can a principle of actuality be receptive of anything?
Exactly. Yeah. And so when this comes up in Scotus, then for Scotus, he has this principle of hyxeatos, that everything is a principle of thisness. So he's not so concerned anymore about using matter as the principle of individuation, which has led many people to misread Scotus as rejecting spiritual matter. But Michael Sullivan shows in his dissertation is that Scotus does actually affirm it, because you still need it as a principle of change. But as a result of Scotus shifting the Franciscan view from matter as the principle of individuation to hyxeatos as the principle of individuation, the Franciscans are no longer as interested in defending this position. And so as a result, it sort of historically drops out of the debate.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, all right. That was a very good discussion about spiritual matter. I'll try and link Michael Sullivan's dissertation in the description. As I understand it, it's a very interesting debate, because when St. Thomas brings it the discussion up, he sort of posits I think it's Avicebron as a sort of like the main defender of spiritual matter, but what Sullivan sort of points out is this is sort of more like a rhetorical tactic. I mean, Avicebron's not the only one, and he's not really the best one to posit spiritual matter.
I think the most clear source it's in that's really popular at the time is Damascene.
Okay.
And I actually, now that I think about it, I actually don't know if they had this work by Damascene, because I wanted to say that it's in his Fount of Wisdom. But now that I think about it, it's actually in the first part, the Dialectica. And I'm pretty sure only the third part, the De Fide Orthodoxa, that was actually translated into Latin. So I think that, well, Damascene holds this position. Now that I think about it, I don't actually think this is known to the scholastics.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, because it's interesting that I can go a little bit to the Eastern patristics here, is the Eastern patristics think very clearly that there's spiritual matter. And the reason they're concerned about this is that for them, this is the analogy they want to give to dispute monophysitism. So they want to dispute that Christ has one nature, and their analogy for how the two natures of Christ subsist in one person is that there are actually two natures within a human. There's the nature of the soul and the nature of the body that are then united within one person.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so this is an argument, I think it originates with Leontius of Byzantium, and then it gets picked up again by Damascene. Maximus the Confessor, I've been a little unclear on if he holds this view or not, but he seems to hold something very close to it. And so...
Okay. All right. Well, would you want to just dive right into Blessed Scotus's position? As I understand it, we sort of hinted that he holds that there's the intellective soul and there's the corporeal form, and this is sort of Scotus's position. But
yeah.
Could you say more?
Well, actually, if Scotus holds a corporeal form is actually a debated topic within scholarship. So, sort of the two main books in English on Scotus's view of form are Richard Cross's book, The Physics of Scotus, and Thomas Ward's book, Scotus on Hylomorphism. I don't remember the exact title of it, but it's something like that. And so Cross actually does defend that Scotus holds a corporeal form near the end of his life, but there's passages in the Ordinatio that seem to suggest that. But interestingly, if we go to Scotus's main work where he's just discussing metaphysics, it's his questions on the metaphysics of Aristotle. And there he actually denies that there's a corporeal form, and he has a much more interesting solution to this whole problem. So to go a little bit back on what Scotus is looking at, for Scotus, he actually goes down to about the level of organs and says that, right, if you take off somebody's hand, for example, it still seems to be a hand. And so he argues that each organ within the body has a distinct form. And he asked them the question of the level below this, right? Do the elements have distinct forms? And he ultimately comes to the conclusion that the elements don't. If something has certain amounts of different elements in it, it just causes it to tend one way or the other, another based on those elements. But he thinks that when you get down to the level of organs, these things still seem to have distinct forms from one another. And so this causes him to posit you have the form of the soul, you have the form of these different organs, but how does all of this come together as the form of one person, right? How do we not fall into St. Thomas's objection?
Sure.
And Scotus, interestingly here, takes stuff that's usually used for arguments for the existence of God. So to go back to the classical arguments for the existence of God, we have an argument based on efficient and final causality. And in both of these cases, we have to argue this is not an accidental series, right? So for example, right, a father could beget a son who begets another son who begets another son. And setting aside the question of whether an actual infinity is possible or not, if we grant that an actual infinity could theoretically be possible, then it does seem that a father could beget a son in an infinite series here, and that we would never actually get back to God.
Right.
And so what both Scotus and St. Thomas do is posit that there is actually an essential series of causality, of actuality, right? So one thing is in potential, which is made more actual by something, which is made more actual by another, ultimately going back to God, who is pure actuality. And so God is able then to cause this whole series of actuality, and it's essentially ordered. So the sort of the classical example of an essentially ordered series is that a hand pushes a stick, pushes a rock. So if the hand lets go of the stick, the rock stops moving, even though the hand isn't pushing the rock, right? Because the stick has no power in itself to move the rock. The stick only receives that power through the hand. And so it's an essentially ordered causal series, because if the first member in the series ceased causing, the entire series ceases instantly.
Okay. And then so is it the case then that this also, if it applies to this case, it also applies to the distinct organs of the body?
Yeah, so he wants to say then that what makes the body united is that it's essentially ordered together. So within the example of the hand pushes the stick, pushes the rock, this is a, what would we say? It's a approximately essentially ordered causal series. So, right, there's, the rock is caused by the hand, and the stick is caused by the hand in one series of causes there. But if, for example, we had a stick that had two branches and we were pushing two separate rocks, those rocks would both be in an essentially ordered causal series, but they would be remotely causally ordered. So both of them are within the same essentially ordered causal series, but they're not caused in the same order, right? So there's a distinct path of causal series going on for these two rocks, but they seem to be part of the same essential causal series regardless. And so Scotus says they're remotely essentially ordered.
Interesting.
So the different organs of the body with respect to the person are remotely essentially ordered. So all of them are connected to this causal series, where they cease to perform their function within this causal series unless they are part of this body and part of this, right? So if you cut off the hand, it ceases to perform its function as a hand. It leaves this essentially ordered causal series.
Okay. So we know that Scotus holds this this theory with respect to the distinct organs in the body. Each organ has its own form. But would Scotus hold that this also applies for like the Aristotelian basic elements? And I guess if he were alive today, do you think he'd hold this for subatomic particles and the like?
Yeah, before I get into that, I just want to mention one thing briefly on the
Oh,
form
sure.
of corporeality, because this brings up the question that is sort of the debate between Ward and Cross on this issue. Is
Mm,
that Scotus, in the questions on the metaphysics of Aristotle, where he discusses this most in detail, seems there to possibly deny the form of corporeality. He raises that there's then a form of corporeality which sits on top of the other forms and unites them all. And
mm,
that's not the direction that Scotus ends up taking his argument, which then the implication is that he's rejecting it.
right.
Versus in the Ordinatio, he mentions a number of times and what Scotus does actually say within the questions on the metaphysics of Aristotle is that the first form we get that unites everything is the sensitive soul.
Mm,
So there's no form of corporeality, but then you do have the sensitive soul, because that's
okay.
what's going to then receive the sense information from the organs and then transmit that to the intellect within the rational soul.
I
And that
see.
this then is the causally ordered series. While in the Ordinatio, he refers to the forma corporealitas, the form of the body, a number of times. And so the question is, for Cross, he's changed his position and now he affirms it. Whereas for Ward, this is just shorthand for all these different organs in this essentially ordered series, then it doesn't
Sure.
actually exist. It's
Sure.
just this thing we refer to for that. It does seem to me that Cross's position makes more sense by Scotus's own logic. That it
Sure.
seems that if we can posit that there is a sensitive soul, which is receiving this, it does seem that there has to then be a corporeal form, which is then going to unite all of these and order them to the sensitive soul.
Fascinating.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, so then for the elements, so Scotus doesn't think, right, that he thinks that when you have, for example, let's say the hand, and it decomposes into the four elements,
Yes.
he thinks that these four elements, we don't really see them or observe them within the hand itself. We observe
Mhm.
their tendencies. So we observe, for example, the earth, right? The element of earth, which is going to cause it to fall closer to the ground. And these sorts of elements are within it, but they're not really within it. They're only virtually within it, because it's only once it decomposes that they actually come to be. We only have their tendencies before that.
Okay.
But for I think he might want to rethink some of the details of this if he were alive today. So the
Sure.
first point I want to bring up is with which maybe before we get into that, we should discuss the last part of Scotus's own view, which is on matter itself.
Sure. Sure.
Yes, I want to discuss some of these other things before we move off of Scotus into modern times. Let's finish fully fleshing out Scotus's view.
Sure.
Because the last, yeah.
Yeah, I think that with respect to like just Scotus and modern science, we could maybe like save that for last. But yeah, I think that
Yeah,
makes sense to discuss his theory of prime matter.
yeah. So his theory of prime matter, right, is that Aristotle's concern with prime matter is that, right, this is what remains the same, right? So if we take a block of marble, right, and we hammer it into this marble statue of Hermes, the
Mhm.
marble seems to remain the same there. Or even if we have the body, and they were looking more maybe at an artifact, someone could
Sure.
argue. But
Sure.
if we're even looking at something like the hand, which then decomposes into the earth when you bury it,
Mhm.
um, it seems here there's still something remaining common between the two. But for Scotus, if this was just purely potential, what actually is the same between them? That it seems that if matter is pure potentiality, then it isn't actually anything. So now there's not anything that's the same between them. And so for Scotus, he says that matter actually has some degree of actuality. It has
Mm.
actuality only insofar as we're positing that it exists.
Right. As I understand, this was also, I believe, Saint Bonaventure also holds to this position that
So
he adheres to that prime matter has some sort of actuality with respect to it.
so for Saint Bonaventure, he doesn't fully get to that. He does posit that there is prime matter, which is completely potential. But then
Okay.
he posits that there's this sort of prime matter that exists within the real world, which he says is light, because he says that all things are receiving their being from the sun. And so they're receiving this light, which is making up everything. Which interestingly, if we want to get in modern science, I think it's really interesting that light is sort of one of these basic versions of energy, and all matter is composed of energy. I mean, actually, the world does receive most of its energy from the sun. So I think it's interesting that Bonaventure, through sort of a natural reason of reasoning, that it seems like the plants are receiving their light from, they're receiving their power from the sun, and then we're eating those and getting our energy from that. But it's in, and then, well, if they're receiving light, this light must then be turning into this matter. It's interesting that through natural reason, he's getting to a position quite close to all the advancements of modern science here.
Right.
And so I think Scotus here is saying this question of what St. Thomas calls designated matter, what St. Bonaventure calls light. He's saying that this is just matter. Okay. That, right, prime matter is just this, because if we want to posit anything more potential than that, it just doesn't exist.
Okay.
And we should also touch on another argument for Scotus's view, which is the theological one.
Well, I mean, one question I wanted to ask right before we get to the theology bit is, in your view, does Scotus's theory posit a problem for like the mind-body problem that we might eventually find in Descartes and the like? Because Richard Crossan at a gloss seems to think that, you know, there might be a similar problem with Scotus's theory that we might have for like a Cartesian dualism.
I don't think it does so much, because he still wants to posit, right, that we have this essentially ordered causal series. And it's sort of a formal causality here, right? Because he doesn't want to go to Peter John of Alevi's position that was later condemned, which is that the form is not the that the soul is not the form of the body. For Scotus, there is still this formal causality going on in this essentially ordered series.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I think this isn't an issue, because it's not as though we have the brain acting on its own that's then connected to another substance of the soul. These are still connected within this series. And so the body can't think without the rational soul acting upon it through formal causality.
I see. Okay. Okay, that seems to clear things up. But yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to dive right into the theology controversy. Well, as I understand it, one of the reason why this was such a controversial claim, the unicity of substantial form, was it seemed to suggest that Christ's corpse that was in the tomb wasn't really the body of Christ. It was like a configured body. And it had been sort of offhand defined at a council that it was still the body of Christ. I can't remember which council it was at. And so this was not, everyone agreed that it was. Right. And so those who posited a unicity of form sort of had to say that there was an exception for Christ because of the unity that came about through the hypostatic union. This created sort of a higher degree of unity within Christ that allowed, as far as I understand, hope a Thomist could clarify more St. Thomas's exact position, but it seems almost this is just an exception to the rule, according to St. Thomas. But it got to the point where I can't remember who it was, but there was actually one scholastic, I think before St. Thomas, who, if I remember correctly, was in England. I'm trying to remember the details of this whole story. Got excommunicated by his local bishop for denying the form of the body, because it seemed to deny that the body of Christ was Christ's actual body. Sure. And so this wasn't just a philosophical problem. It had these theological implications. And another one, which wasn't discussed so much at the time, but seems like a significant issue for any Catholic, is relics. Yes. So right, if we want to venerate the body of, I think we have the relics of St. Thomas, right? So if we want to go and venerate the relics of St. Thomas, are we actually venerating the relics of St. Thomas? Right. Or are we venerating the relics, which, remember, the only thing they had in common is this prime matter, which, as we see, doesn't even exist. So they have nothing in common, essentially, at this point. We're venerating something that has some degree of continuity with what was once the body of St. Thomas. But that doesn't seem to be what the church teaches on the matter. The church seems to teach that this is actually the body of St. Thomas. Right. And I do believe that this particular issue, I mean, more than any other position that St. Thomas held, was the most controversial doctrine that he held, the unicity of substantial form. And I think that a lot of Franciscans, especially like John Peckham sort of like vitriolically went after him
Yeah.
for this position. Yeah.
Yeah, there was quite a number of things about it. And it's interesting that it's flipped around so much where now if I come in and propose within Catholic metaphysics circles that there is a plurality of forms, that's the controversial position. So I think it's interesting how it's shifted.
It is funny how these things change. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
And does Scotus's theory also have any sort of ramifications for the resurrection of the body? Is that all related?
Not that I know of. I'd have to check his discussion in the Ordinatio of the resurrection of the body, because he has quite a long discussion of the resurrection in book 4 of the Ordinatio. So I'm sure there's a discussion of it somewhere. But I just don't know about it.
Okay, and I think after this, I'm gonna head on over to the Tertia Pars myself and see if Aquinas has an answer to this difficulty.
Yeah.
It does seem to sort of pinpoint a very serious theological error if a person holds to this.
And I think it's interesting the body of Christ wouldn't got discussed so much, because it's a problem, right? You can sort of get around that. But for me, the one that really strikes me is the question of relics, because now we don't have a sort of special exception for the Word. We now have a special exception for all saints.
Sure.
Right? So is it actually only those who go to hell who are now separated from their body? And what about those who go to purgatory for a while and then make it to heaven? Are they now reunited with their bodies? Right? We start raising all sorts of issues.
Right. Yeah. I definitely see the issue. Well, I mean, okay, so we've talked about issues, but we could also maybe talk about we alluded to modern science and maybe how Scotus could maybe sort of help us here. How can Scotus's thesis of a plurality of substantial forms sort of inform how we see modern atomic science or organ transplants or parts of the body? Do you think that he has a lot to offer?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting discussion of this by Father Christopher Davenport, also known as Father Francis Santa Clara, because that was his name in the religious life. And there's a really good article on this by Anne Davenport. I don't know if she has any relationship to Father Christopher, because they're separated by about 300 years there, or 400 years. But he's discussing around the time of the late 1600s, if I remember correctly, as modern atomic theory is just beginning to develop, and Epicurus, an ancient atomist, is becoming very popular again.
Right.
And he has this whole treatise discussing, can we actually take anything of benefit here? Because they seem to be answering some questions, and they seem to be having some physical observations that defend their view. Interestingly, those physical observations turn out not to be the actual evidence for atoms, because their observation was when they have a mixture, they seem to see things falling out of it, and they thought those little particles they were seeing in the mixture falling out were the atoms. But he wants to discuss this, and he suggests that somewhere down to the level of atoms, so further than Scotus was willing to go, is a substantial form, and that we can use this same discussion of essentially ordered causal series and having forms that order these essentially ordered causal series to go down to these level of atoms and build up from here. And also, interestingly, he discusses that atoms in some sense then seem to be a fluid as well as a particle. So interestingly, somewhat getting to what later quantum physics would get at, of that particles are both particles and waves at the same time. He seems to be getting that through trying to reason through this. But I think that this can really help us out with discussing problems in modern physics, because it doesn't seem that when we observe, let's say, a carbon molecule in a human body and in a tree and floating in the air, it doesn't seem to me that the scientists are actually observing any differences within the atom itself. So it seems a little absurd to say that it only virtually exists within the tree and within the person. It seems that it does have a real existence there and a real independent existence. But at the same time, if we just see, that's where the form is, how do we solve that issue then? How do we have a form of a person? And I think Scotus's discussion of essentially ordered series really does save us here, where we can have now formal causality at the level of, say, something like the molecule, and formal causality at this higher level. And I think if Scotus was around today, he would posit at least down to the cell that there seems to be formal causality, or there seems to be form, because I mean, we see individual organs within the cell, right? We see cells acting individually. So it seems that within these individual organs within the cell, they would each seem to have substantial form. And I think that this just builds further upon the logic that Scotus had in applying it to solve issues. So I think quite a number of Thomists have raised interesting points about how quantum physics seems to be getting closer to Aristotelianism, because now we seem to have the sort of prime matter of this energy that only really exists once it's informed as a certain particle.
Right.
But it seems to me then that this might argue for substantial form on the level of particles, but how does this argue for substantial form on the level of biological beings?
Sure.
And I think, again, this is where we can bring in Scotus to this discussion. I think Scotus really solves this issue here. I know one of the objections that Rob Koons raises against Scotus's view is that it gets too close to atomic theory, that we seem to be breaking down matter into just sort of atoms. But I mean, it seems to me that there is abundant experimental observation of atoms. Now, it's interesting, though, that when we start getting below the level about molecules, and especially atoms, we actually start being unable to observe these different particles that exist within it. We can detect they're there. So we can detect electrons exist, but we cannot observe an electron. And especially if we want to break down a proton into its quarks, again, we can sense their presence there, but we can't experimentally directly observe them there. And the reason that scientists come up for this is that shooting a photon at these particles, the photons are starting to get to be almost the size of, if not bigger than, these particles. And so when you shoot a photon at it to observe it, it's actually affecting and destroying the atom. And so we're actually unable to observe it. But we can detect the effects and mathematically calculate they must be there. And this seems to me that the level of substantial form then is probably somewhere around the level of the atom or the molecule, because we know that, right, these elements substantially exist. Even if there's a different list of elements we have than Scotus had, we can seem to detect that they must virtually exist within these atoms, because we can detect their tendency towards one thing or another. And this allows us, is why one atom is different from another atom. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they really exist within there. Now, maybe they do really exist, but it seems to me we can place substantial form somewhere around that level. Now, I don't know if it's at the level of the atom or the molecule. I think that still is very open, because it does seem that molecules have properties, they have powers that atoms don't have.
Right.
So, for example, water, there doesn't seem you can reduce the powers of H2O to hydrogen and oxygen. It seems that it has its own unique powers, which couldn't simply be produced from that. Now, we can predict what a molecule might do based on its atoms, but that should also be fine within Scotus's view, because we still are knowing the elements that are within it and detecting tendencies there.
Fascinating. Yeah, I definitely feel like a lot of the sort of like so-called river forest Thomists, a lot of what they've done and try to revitalize Thomism and the philosophy of nature, I think that they've made a very convincing case that a lot of modern scientific claims are very compatible with Aristotelian physics, but I definitely think that you're right, that Scotus has a lot of interesting insights that might help us understand how we see particles and the things at the molecular level.
Yeah, and I think part of this is coming from the problem that we now have, that we have a metaphysics that has no application to the real world because it refuses to say it could have any influence on physics. And we have a physics that makes no sense because it doesn't have metaphysics. So when we talk about these atoms, but we don't even know what we mean by these words because we have no definition of matter.
Gotcha.
And so I think that this is this big problem that we separated physics and metaphysics. The two can no longer inform each other. And I think that this could really help the two get back in dialogue, that we now have a metaphysics that can explain the discoveries we've found within modern physics, and can also then allow modern physics to have explanations that make sense. And I think that this also then might alleviate some of the concerns that general relativity then might alleviate some of the concerns that general relativity and quantum physics don't align with each other.
Right.
Because now general relativity is studying form above the level of, is studying effects above the level of substantial form. And quantum physics is studying the tendency of elements below substantial form. Well, of course, you're going to get very different results with those two because you're fundamentally looking at completely different problems there.
Gotcha. Okay, then. Well, I think we've covered everything that I've wanted to discuss. Maybe as a conclusion, would you have any recommended sources or reading that you'd propose? I know that we've mentioned Richard Cross a few times, and I've also read some of Mary Beth Ingham's philosophical vision of John Duns Scotus, and I think that's also pretty accessible. But yeah, I've also heard Scotus to say that that it's not a very good work. Are there any works that you'd recommend?
I actually would recommend Ingham's work. Okay. The Scotus I've talked to generally are positive towards her work.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a problem within modern Scotism, is that it's no longer working within a tradition. This is why I love somebody like Father Peter Damian Fellner or Jared Goff, is they read Scotus through the lens of later commentators on Scotus, such as Bartholomew Mastrius, Parthenio Minguez, St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Lawrence of Brindisi. We have this whole tradition of commentary on Scotus.
Sure.
Well, we have to sort of get back to the sources view. And so this is why we have debates between Ingham and Voss and Ward and Cross on what does Scotus mean in all these areas. And it's not as though there was complete agreement, but there was a general tradition of reading Scotus. And so you see this within Thomism too, right? There's a general tradition of reading St. Thomas which is then debate the people who want to get back to St. Thomas himself and say we can totally ignore the commentatorial tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that you really get that with Etienne Gilson in particular, that he really sort of sees this, get back to St. Thomas and, it's sort of eschew sort of the commentatorial tradition. I really think that that's kind of a flaw in a lot of the neo-Thomists is that they want to sort of disregard. And
I think this is the same issue. And luckily for Thomists, a lot of the sources have been translated to English, versus for Scotus, a lot of these sources simply haven't been translated. Right. And so you have to wade through, even though I can read Latin, I prefer not to wade through hundreds of pages of Latin because my Latin is not that good.
Right.
Not enough to read that long amounts of Latin. And so that's a big issue we have with accessing some of this stuff.
Sure.
And so, but I do think with the philosophical vision of Scotus, she has a great discussion of Scotus's psychology within that.
Okay.
I think she misses the influence that Bonaventure has on Scotus in this psychology, but overall, it's a good introduction.
Okay, nice.
The only modern writer who captures that is Fellner, because he actually reads the historical people reconciling Bonaventure and Scotus.
Sure.
Then I think another good one on this specific issue, the best work I think is Thomas Ward's book on form within Scotus. Here, let me go pull up the name of it so I can get. So it's John Duns Scotus on parts, wholes, and hylomorphism.
Nice.
And the central argument in the book, the sort of main chapters where he discusses the argument for essentially ordered causality, is actually earlier released as an article. So if you just want to read those chapters, you can find an article he wrote on it a few years before the book came out. But in the book, he then starts off by discussing prime matter and then discusses other things such as mixtures within Scotus, and also an interesting problem that Scotus has here of how do we not have a form of the whole world, right? So how do we stop at the level of the person? And
I have seen whether like the Earth is to be considered as a substance. I have heard that was a medieval debate.
And so Scotus denies it, but Ward sort of brings up that Scotus doesn't really seem to have a good reason to deny it.
Sure.
He sort of seems to not like it, but he doesn't go into full detail. And so, it's a chapter. I'd like to read the chapter over again to get a full sense of Scotus's ideas on it. Nice. But that is an issue that's being raised here that should, I think, be more thought about if Scotus has here. What I would say, though, is I think once we have this form of the body and then again the form of the soul, that sort of unites them all. It does seem to unite them towards one common substance. And it does seem, though, that maybe we could discuss form at a higher level. So, for example, we talk about the formal causality of the civil society, of the city. Well, how can we have a formal causality of a society if it doesn't actually have form? So maybe it doesn't have substantial form, but it does seem to me that maybe you do want to posit some sort of form there, that this could answer questions within political philosophy there.
Sure.
This also then, I think, brings in the whole hierarchy of being that St. Dionysius lays out, that we have this hierarchy of the celestial hierarchy that's then connected to a whole hierarchy of being within the universe.
Sure.
That Scotus is much more Aristotelian in his language. So he doesn't use this Platonic way of describing it. But it seems to me we can bring in this discussion of essentially ordered causes to have a sort of more Aristotelian explanation of the great chain of being. That we now have this hierarchy of being which is ordered through essentially ordered final causes all the way back to God.
Nice. I think that's pretty much, I think this was a very good episode. Gideon, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a good discussion.